Overlord Volume 5 Chapter 1. A Young Man's Heart. Part 1. Love Fire Month, 9th month, 2nd day, 23:30. The man lit the lantern that hung at his waist. It used a special oil for fuel, which produced a green flame, and it gave off a creepy-looking light which illuminated the surroundings. He stepped outside, and felt as though he were walking into a wall of heat. A look of distaste crossed the man's face, but the season had always been hot to begin with, and nothing could be done about it. Around this period, every place in the kingdom was still muggy and unpleasant, even after sunset. That said, the time of harsh heat was gone, and the temperature ought to go down as time went by. Still, there was no sign that it was changing for the cooler. Today was hot too. Yeah, I heard that it's cooler up north, near the ocean, the man grumbled. His partner for tonight replied, if only there were some rain. That would take the edge off the heat. He looked to the sky as he said that. The sky was clear. There were no clouds in the sky, to say nothing of rain clouds. The constellations seemed abnormally large, but it was simply the usual night sky. Yeah, some rain would be good. Alright, time to work. It would not be quite right to describe these men as ordinary villagers. For starters, they were armed. They wore leather armor and had long swords at their waist. Far too militarized for ordinary village guards. In addition, their faces and bodies did not look like those of farmers, but hinted at a familiarity with violence. The two of them walked into the village without a sound. Shrouded in night, the village was silent save for their footsteps. They pressed forward steadily amidst this sinister atmosphere, as though nothing else lived here. Their calm attitude suggested that patrols like these were daily business for them. The village they walked in was surrounded by a high wall, and there were 6 watchtowers within sight. They looked sturdy and well built. Even frontier villages which were frequently attacked by monsters would not boast such formidable watchtowers. This was not so much a village as a military base. Even so, a third party might only consider this to be a heavily fortified village. However, what that observer saw next would truly furrow their brow. Under normal circumstances, most people would only encircle residences and storehouses when building a wall, and leave the crop fields outside. That was because a wall that was big enough to include the fields would be a ruinous investment of time and money. However, this village had done precisely that, gathering the green fields of crops which swayed in the night wind into its walls, within the village. It was as though said crops were gold bullion which had to be hoarded. The men walking through this strange village felt someone looking at them from a watchtower. The fact was that there were bow-armed men on the towers. All he needed to do was raise his lantern high in case of an emergency, and his friends would come to his aid. That said, when he thought about his colleagues' skills, the man was not very excited about having them support him with arrow shots. However, he was greatly reassured by the fact that his friends could wake all their comrades by ringing the alarm bell. His colleagues who were sleeping between shifts would give him an earful if he raised his lantern by mistake. However, the man was determined to wave it at the merest sign that something was wrong. He did not wish to lose his life over a small matter. That said, he did not actually think anything bad would happen. They had been performing the same patrols for several months, and he imagined that these patrols would carry on forever. As he considered his future with distaste, the man continued his slow walk through the village down his fixed route. Halfway through his patrol, a serpentine object suddenly wrapped itself around the man's neck. No, that was not a snake. The object that wrapped itself around his mouth and did not let go was an octopus tentacle. Right after it lifted the man's chin, searing pain blossomed over his exposed throat. This sequence of actions took less than a second. A gurgling sound, like that of drinking, came from his throat. That was the last sound the man would ever hear in his life. The hand holding his mouth let go, supporting him from behind so he would not slump to the ground. After verifying that the man had been thoroughly exsanguinated, his assailant pulled out the vampire blade, the weapon which had killed him. The being holding the man upright was a figure in black. Its entire body was obscured in jet black clothing save its eyes. Said clothing was made of cloth, with gauntlets and other pieces of armor to improve defensive ability. A metal plate covered its chest, but it bulged visibly, giving it the shape of a pair of feminine breasts. Another similarly dressed figure emerged from behind the other man's back. Much like her partner, she wore a metal breastplate. The first looked to the second, and nodded. She scanned her surroundings after verifying the silent death of her victim. It would seem nobody had noticed this. Somewhere in the corner of her heart, she breathed a sigh of relief. The lanterns illuminated them, but the observers from the platform above should not be able to see them, given that they were pressed tightly against the two men. All they had to worry about was that they might be spotted in the instant of their shadow step, a short-ranged teleportation from one shadow to another, but that worry was a thing of the past now. She paid no attention to the dagger, whose bright red hue had become even more vibrant after Dre blood, and propped up the man's body before it could collapse. From the observation platform above, it looked like the two patrolling men had stopped in their tracks. However, if they kept the two men standing still or let them slump to the ground, someone would be suspicious. Something had to be done right away. However, that was not their job. Suddenly, the woman felt the man's limp body lurch under her hand, as though someone had driven a stake into it. In the next moment, she knew she had not been mistaken. The man lurched into stiff motion. The man was still moving despite being clearly dead, but the woman was not alarmed. Everything was proceeding as planned. She let go and at the same time activated a skill. This was a ninja technique she had learned, called Shadow Meld. With this ability, she could fuse seamlessly with any shadow and become invisible to the naked eye. The two of them blended into the men's shadows, and the men stepped forward, like they had been suddenly unshackled. The pause and then the way they walked their original patrol route looked like they had suddenly remembered what they had to do. However, they moved slowly and clumsily. Their wounds had not been healed, but they did not leak blood either. That was because said blood had been completely drained from their bodies. The two men had become zombies, obediently following the will of their creator. There was no other explanation for how they could still move in that state. The women were not the zombies' creator. To an average observer, there were only two men here. Even if one saw through the women's camouflage, there would only appear to be four people here. However, there was a fifth person present. This fifth person was the creator of the zombies. Their eyes could not see anything, but one of the ninja skills they had learned allowed them to detect the presence of those who were concealed by magic or some other skills, and one such entity stood before them. The preparations here are complete. Perfect. She spoke quietly and received a similarly hushed reply. Got it. I saw it all. I'll be heading to the next location. I need to catch someone who's sufficiently important. Another female voice. However, hers was higher pitched, giving the impression of a tender maiden. We're going to begin our assault too. How about the other two? Are they slacking off because they can't contribute? As if they're hiding near the village and they've set themselves up. In an emergency, they'll launch a frontal assault coordinated with you for a pincer attack. Alright, I'll be heading towards priority 1. Stick to the plan, you two. The concealed companion floated gracefully, at least, they got that impression into the sky. It seemed consistent with the movement granted by the fly spell. The presence drew further away, until she vanished into the building she had designated as Priority 1. This was one of the structures within the village, and a key point which had to be taken. In truth, other buildings should have had higher priority, but this place took precedence over the others once the problem of the message spell came into play. Many people regarded that form of magical communication as unreliable, and so it was rarely used. However, there were others who did not think of it in that way and made use of it. For instance, there was the Empire and its cadre of nationally trained magic casters. A certain number of important traders who valued the quick reception of information, and then the enemies who controlled this village. Therefore, their top priority was to apprehend the communications personnel within the building. Since their colleague was already on their way, they had to hide themselves near their objective as quickly as possible. This was because they had to act simultaneously and launch their attack before the enemy discovered their presence. The two ninjas exhaled suddenly, and ran. Normal people would not be able to follow the way they flitted from dark corner to dark corner. On top of that, when they used the magic items they had on them, even high-leveled adventurers would have a very hard time spotting them. In other words, nobody in the village could detect them. One of them flashed a series of hand signals to her companion as they ran. Though it was merely a series of finger-bending movements, the meaning was immediately clear. "We're lucky they didn't have dogs," came the reply. Agreed. This was sign language, of a kind commonly used by assassins. To consummate professionals like themselves, these hand signals were as quick as regular speech. They had also taught their companions the language, but said colleagues had only learned how to make simple gestures and basic secret signals. In contrast, the pair of them had a wide enough vocabulary and sufficient signing speed to use that sign language for everyday speech, and they frequently passed secret messages to each other in that way. Good point. Things are much easier without dogs being drawn by the scent of blood. If the patrollers had brought dogs with them, the assassinations would not have been so easy. While they had ways to deal with dogs, it was better to not have to deal with troublesome things. After her response, her companion rapidly signaled. "Then, I'll head for my designated building," she replied. "Got it," and then her companion peeled away and to the side. This left her to run by herself. She glanced aside to the fields. Those fields did not grow wheat, grains or green vegetables. The plants there were the raw ingredient for a forbidden drug whose spread was on the rise throughout the kingdom, called black powder. There were many such fields within the walls of this village, and they all grew the same crop. This proved that this village was a center of drug cultivation. The drug known as black powder was also known as Layla powder. It was a black, powdery substance that was dissolved into water and drunk. This drug was easy to mass-produce, cheap, and gave its users an easily accessible high-end sense of intoxication. Thus, it was one of the most famous drugs in the kingdom. While it was toxic in addition to the above-mentioned effects, its users often believed that it had no side effects, and so it was widely abused. She snorted as she thought about the black powder's side effects. All drugs had side effects. "I can quit any time I want to," was the stuff of a madman's ravings. After dissecting the corpses of black powder addicts, they found that their brains had shrunk to 4/5 the size of a normal person's. Black powder, made from a concoction of wild plants, was originally a powerful poison. Who would believe that such a toxic plant was not poisonous? The black powder, which was ubiquitous on the streets, was a narcotic that was made from a cultivar of the original plant which had reduced potency. Even so, the black powder was still very poisonous, and it would only be eliminated from the body after a very long time had passed. As a result, many abusers who stopped using the drug often dosed themselves again before it had completely left the body. As a result, after reaching a certain stage of addiction, it was nearly impossible for users to quit the habit cold turkey, unless the priests used their magic to forcibly purge their system of the drug. The most troublesome part about drugs like these were their subtle signs of addiction. Even users on a bad trip did not show signs of physical violence and harm others. Thus, the higher-ups in the kingdom did not understand the danger of black powder, and it had practically received their silent approval. It was little wonder that the empire had submitted formal complaints on the matter, on the suspicion that the kingdom was running an underground industry in the production of black powder. While she had still been an assassin, she had used black powder on occasions, and her organization had grown the plants need to make it. As a result, she was not personally opposed to the substance. Drugs like that could be put to efficacious use if applied properly. The fact was that it was simply a dangerous medicinal herb. However, she had been hired for this job, and her personal opinion had no say in it. Still, requests that don't go through the Adventurers Guild are a little dangerous. She was not entirely comfortable with this request. She frowned under the cloth covering her face. The requester for this job was a friend of her team's leader. While she had been reassured that the other party would remunerate him appropriately, not going through the guild might cause problems. That was true even if they were one of the two adamantite-ranked adventurer parties in the kingdom. Isn't it three of them now? As she thought about the newest adamantite-ranked adventurer team, she arrived at the building designated No. 2. Her task was to recover all the intelligence within this building, and then to set the fields on fire. The thick smoke emitted by the burning drugs was poisonous, but it had to be done to complete the mission. It was quite possible that the wind might carry the smoke in a direction that would harm the villagers, but they did not have the time or the ability to evacuate the villages. Sacrifices must be made. With those words to herself, she cast all thoughts of the villagers' safety out of her mind. She had been trained as an assassin from childhood, and death rarely troubled her heart. In particular, she was unmoved by the sad fates of strangers, regardless of what tragedies befell them. The only thing she disliked was the look on her leader's face whenever someone had to be sacrificed. However, she had obtained her leader's approval while drawing up this plan, so the thought of saving others did not even cross her mind. More importantly, after the attack here was completed, she would need to use teleportation magic to move to another village and burn it down as well. That plan occupied her mind and consumed all her efforts. This was not the only site which grew the raw materials for drugs. According to their research, there were 10 large-scale plantations within the kingdom, and those might not even be all of them. Otherwise, they would not be able to sustain the massive quantities of drugs being trafficked throughout the kingdom. All we can do is pull up the weeds where we find them. It's tiring, but there's no other way. Ideally, they would be able to find written orders within this village, but that was not likely. All they could do was hope that this village's supervisor or equivalent had information of similar importance. Leader would be happy if we could find some traces of the organization's involvement in this. The criminal organization which grew these drugs was known as Eight Fingers. The name came from the eight-fingered god of thieves who was a vassal of the earth god. It was a vast criminal syndicate that dominated the kingdom's underworld. This organization was divided into 8 divisions, responsible for the slave trade, for assassination, smuggling, burglary, drug trafficking, security, finance and gambling. These 8 divisions worked together as the collective kingpins of the kingdom's crime. Due to the size of their organization, their full extent was veiled in secrecy. However, there was a clear sign of the extent of the influence within the kingdom. That was the village before her eyes. They were openly growing contraband plants in villages. That alone was proof that the lord of the land was in cahoots with them. However, even an official inquiry would not bear fruit. Even if the royal household began an investigation or took legal action, actually bringing the nobles in question to justice was very difficult. The lord of the land would certainly say, "I didn't know these plants were the raw materials for drugs," or he would simply dump the problem on the villagers and say it was their idea. There were limits to the legal action that could be taken, and even if one wished to stop the flow of drugs, the process would be imped by corrupt nobles aligned to the organization. The situation had deteriorated to the point where those who stood on the right side of the law could no longer resolve it. Therefore, they were left with the last resort of using violence and burning the fields down. Her frank opinion was that burning these drugs was only treating the symptoms, and not the disease. The illegal organization eating away at the heart of the kingdom was too powerful, and their political backing was too strong. We're just buying time. If we can't turn things around, then all these efforts will be for naught.